Now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by the son of York. Of course, only if the Yorkist player received a good hand of cards and managed to use it well in Son of York, a new game by GMT that covers the Wars of the Roses. This is a two-player card game that actually, to be honest, has been around for a while, but it was only available in print and play form. This recent edition is the first box deluxe edition. This card game is based on the Dixie system that was at the core of several Colombian uncollectible card games that came out in the 90s, like Shiloh and Bull Run. And these games are about several battles of the American Civil War, of course, given the title. Son of York is more complex than Dixie, but not by much. When it comes to combat, yes, it has more nuances, but the general ideas, the general system definitely are the same. So probably one question is what happens when you take a system that worked with the American Civil War, that was designed to represent the American Civil War, and you use that to talk about the Wars of the Roses. I think it is a legitimate question, and today we're going to try to find an answer to that. Each player in the game has an individual deck of cards, and these decks are pretty substantial. As you can see, cards are of different types. There are combat units, there are several categories of combat units. The most important division to me is between missile units and non-missile units. You have special cards that will allow the opponent player to perform the special action described on the card. Terrain cards will modify combat and movement in the area in which the terrain card is placed. And nobles, some nobles are identified by portraits, some nobles are identified by their coat of arms. As you can see, some cards also have a number printed on them in that red banner. That is the number of orders that that card is worth. The game doesn't come with a board, so you will have to use the power of imagination to mentally divide the play area according to this diagram. The game will take place mainly in these three wings, columns. The rulebook calls them battles, and I will call them battles too, even though I found the term a little confusing as I was reading the rulebook. So you will have a left battle, central battle, and right battle. Each battle is divided in three areas: a rear, a middle ground, and another rear area. And the battles are surrounded by two flank areas, each of which is divided in two sections, one belonging to each player. At the beginning of each turn, players roll for initiative and the winner decides who goes first. That means that in certain cases you may be able to go twice in a row, which can be pretty good. Then the active player takes his morale checks. I'll explain later what those are, because I think that before I explain combat they don't really make much sense. And then the active player declares combat and commits units to combat, which is pretty important because units usually can only fight or move, not both. Units committed to a fight can attack enemy units in the same area, like in this example, but missile units can also attack enemies that are in an adjacent area. For example, missile units in the middle area can attack enemy units in the rear area. And this is why missile units have two ability values, one to be used at short range and one to be used at long range, that is, when an enemy is in an adjacent area. Each combat unit attacks by rolling a number of dice equal to its cohesion value, so yes, this is a game that uses the bucket of dice combat system, and a unit will inflict a hit for each rolled die that shows the ability rating or less. In this case, this unit rolls 4 dice and inflicts a hit on a 1 or a 2. Each hit will be recorded by placing hit markers on the cards of the defending side. These markers look a little creepy, but I kind of like them too. Hits must be distributed as evenly as possible, so each enemy must receive a hit before it can receive a second hit. And for now, nothing happens yet. You place the hit markers there, but there are no immediate effect, with one exception. That is, if a unit receives more hit markers than it has cohesion, in this case 2 hit markers with 1 cohesion, the unit is eliminated immediately during the combat phase. Also, if a leader is present to a battle, that leader can join the fight, and leaders that are committed to a battle will add a die. They will have their own attack, which is resolved by using their ability rating, but most importantly, the leader will lend a +1 bonus to the ability rating of the units that he's leading, which is pretty sweet. Once all combat dice have been rolled and all hits have been assigned, the active player can execute movement with his units that did not attack. And to explain movement, let's go back to the battle board diagram for a minute. A unit that starts the movement phase in the same area with a leader can move for free. The leader just tells that unit where to go. And units can move up to the number of spaces identified on their card at the bottom of the card. Units that do not start the movement phase with a leader can still move, but the owning player must spend orders from his hand in order to be able to move those units. For one order, a player can move one unit that is not engaged in combat into an adjacent position within the same battle, for example, from here to here. For one order, a player can also move a combat unit from his hand into any one of the rear areas on his side of the board. And for 2 orders, a player can move a combat unit from his hand into one of the 2 flank areas on his side of the board. Most movement is within the same battle with few exceptions. For example, if a unit would need to retreat but it would violate the stacking limit by doing so, the unit is allowed to move sideways to avoid overstacking. Of course, only in case the unit is not overstacking here or there isn't a fight going on here, because overstacking can have devastating effects, so you really should avoid that at all costs. Another type of sideways movement occurs when a unit in a flank area launches an attack against a unit that is in the adjacent battle. And if one of the 2 players takes complete control of one of the 3 battles by occupying all 3 areas of a battle, then that battle is completely sealed off to the other player. The opponent cannot recapture that battle in any way, and the player that took control of the battle can now use that battle to launch flank attacks into the adjacent battle. At the end of the turn, you discard as many cards as you want from your hand, and you draw until you have 4 cards in your hand. And deciding which cards stay and which cards go is kind of like a big deal in this game. Because suppose that I have a desperate need to bring combat units to the battle, to the fight, but I only have these cards in my hand, then I don't have any order that allows me to bring these units to the fight, then I decide, well, I'm gonna retain these 2 units here, which are good. I'm gonna discard these 2 units here. But then I draw these 2 cards here. Now again, I'm stuck with a hand that only has combat units and not orders. Then I say, oh, whatever, I really need those units. Next turn, I'm gonna discard everything, so I get better chances of receiving an order card. And I do, but suppose that I draw this card together with 3 combat units that are extremely weak. So that's not ideal either. So definitely a big part of this game is finding a way to maximize your odds of having good units in your hand and also to have enough orders to be able to use those units. Okay, it is finally time to talk about the morale checks that happen at the beginning of a turn. For each unit that suffered hits during the previous combat, the active player will roll a number of dice equal to the hits inflicted. This unit, for example, will roll 2 dice when checking for morale. And if there is a leader present with the same unit that is taking the morale check, the active player also subtracts the leadership value of that leader from all numbers that are rolled. If any one of the modified numbers rolled during the morale check is higher than the cohesion value of the unit, then the unit failed the morale check. And what happens is that that unit retreats by 1 space within the same battle. If the unit is in the middle ground, then the unit retreats to the rear area of the same battle, the rear area belonging to the player. But what happens also is that while retreating, the unit manages to, I guess, regroup because the hit marker is eliminated, is removed, and there is no permanent damage on the unit. The unit retreated, but it is now as fresh and healthy as it was before the fight. However, if the unit does not roll any modifying number which is above the cohesion value, then the unit passes the morale check, then the unit can remain in position, but it has to absorb those hits in terms of damage to the cohesion value. In this case, a unit that does not roll more than 5 during the morale check will stay where it is, but will lose 2 points of cohesion, and you will use these markers here to record the new cohesion value. Now, the first time that I read about this, I thought, well, there must be a mistake. How is it possible that if you fail the morale check, you do not lose cohesion, you do not take any damage, and if you pass the morale check, you take damage? How can that make any sense? Well, it does make sense when you learn that in order to win the game, you need to take control of the central battle rear of the opponent or of both the left and right battle rear of the opponent. That means that if your units keep failing morale checks and keep retreating, they are kind of immortal. They're always fresh and healthy. But you cannot win the game because you keep having your units stuck where they started from. The only way to win the game is to have enough units and to be able to maneuver them well enough and to have them fight well enough that even if they are reduced, they still manage to reach the battle rear of the opponent and they manage to take control of that area. This is a game that I overall enjoyed, but I must say I've also heard mixed reactions and cold reactions. And while I may not agree with the general conclusions, I think that some of these mixed reactions are based on valid considerations about this game. For example, some people complain that this game feels a little static. After all, it is put your units together, send them out, push, and then retreat a little, push, retreat, launch the occasional flank attack, push, retreat, push, retreat. That is true. This is the nature of the game, but personally, I don't think it necessarily means that the game has no subtleties, that the game doesn't create any tension. To me, actually, what the game is about is precisely this: to wait for the right moment, to read the board and see where and when the front line of the opponent may collapse and create a powerful hand of orders and units that will allow you to exploit that and to push against the enemy's rear. But the problem is that, again, this may not always feel like a problem or a challenge or a process completely inherent to wargaming. It feels a little bit like hand management, resource management type of problem. Related to this is the problem that I completely agree with. The game does feel generic. If you think about it in retrospect, after all, if the system came from a game about the American Civil War, so maybe we should have expected this to a certain extent. But yeah, sometimes you do have the sense that if you had these same cards with the numerical values and no reference about the theme, you may not know what the game is about. However, this being said, these are, I think, valid considerations about the game. I do not necessarily agree with the idea that this makes it a bad game. It may not make it like much of a word game. That I agree with. This is not a game that always feels like a word game. May not appeal to word gamers that usually have a very clear idea of what a word game is about and what a word game is not. So again, you have to take that into account, the strong preconceptions that word gamers have. Otherwise, if you manage to make that switch, okay, let's imagine this is not a game about the Wars of the Roses, not a word game about the Wars of the Roses, then it is a game that has interesting challenges. You have to prepare your strategy, prepare a good hand. It is a game, again, about hand management and resource management that really has subtleties. It really is about bringing that point of cohesion there and not there, being able to figure out when is the right time to improve your chances of having a retreat rather than passing a check and absorbing some hits. It is about small things about the resources and strengths that you have on the board. So On the plus side, this is a game that you may be able to play with your non-wargaming friends. On the other side, if you try to play with your hardcore wargaming friends, you may have less than positive reactions. Bottom line, to me, this is a good card game that has a war theme, and because of this, occasionally you may have some misunderstandings happening with players that are looking for a, strictly speaking, card war game.